scripture lesson is kind of lengthy, but it's a long it's a story, and the story is complete as long as I've got it marked in the right place. 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we're going to begin with verse 14, which starts in the middle of... Actually, we're going to start with... where are we here? I had it all together, then I forgot where I put it. Happens a lot. Begin with the 17th verse. Joseph said to his son David, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See how your brothers fare, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth into battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. All the Israelites, when they saw this man, fled from him and were very much afraid. The Israelites said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel." David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people answered him in the same way, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." His eldest brother, Eliab, heard him talking to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He said, "Why have you come down? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down just to see the battle." David said, "What have I done now? It was only a question. He turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repented them before Saul, and he sent for them. David said to him, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servants will go forth and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescued the lamb from its mouth, and if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defiled the armies of the living God." David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the land of this Philistine." So Saul said to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these things. I am not used to them." So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in his shepherd's bag and in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came and drew near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you could come with me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field." But David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistines' army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that in all his assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead, and the stone struck into his forehead, and he fell down on the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, striking down the Philistine and killing him there with no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine. He grasped his sword, drew it out of his sheath, and killed him. Then he cut off his head with it. I think we can end there. That's a long thing to read, but it's quite a story. If you've heard the story of David and Goliath, please raise your hand. I can imagine there's hardly anybody on this earth that has not in some way heard this story. Without a doubt, it's the best known story of David on record. Even people who have never darkened the door of a church have heard this classic account of a shepherd boy slaying the giant. It's become a social icon, and it's used whenever the underdog, the predetermined loser, gains the victory over overwhelming odds. The details of the story is well known. However, there is much to be learned here. Within this beautiful tale, there are theological lessons that we as individuals and as society as a whole desperately need to know. So, as Paul Harvey used to say it, here's the rest of the story. This story took place at the beginning of David's transition from a shepherd boy to a national leader. Israel was at war with the Philistines, a powerful enemy with whom Israel fought for many years. The war was stalled because of a giant named Goliath who taunted the army of Israel and challenged them to combat to determine who would win the day. When David arrives with provisions for his brothers, he learns of the situation and asks the central question that fear kept the rest of the army from asking. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? And we shall see in a moment how central this is to the rest of the story. Paul persuades Saul to let him face Goliath. After some argument and the offer of the king's army, which David refuses, David confronts Goliath, and in a moment's time, Goliath was several inches shorter, at least from the neck up. Now that's the basic plot. But there are theological issues and guidance that we need to learn from this basic story. What we have here is a contest between fear and faith. Let's take fear first. Now, there's much to fear here. Goliath was about 9 feet tall, a man who was trained for war since he was a youth, and he was armed to the teeth. The text goes to great length to describe his armor. He had a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of mail on his upper body. Now, the coat of mail was made up of thousands of small bronze plates, which made it look like the scales of a fish. It weighed about 5,000 shekels. Now, 1 shekel weighs about half an ounce. So, let's see. There are 20 ounces to a pound, which would equal 2,500 ounces, and that would come to, if I did the math right, over 200 pounds. That's just on his armor of his chest. I remember how heavy that 50-pound pack got when I went on large marches. He had a large protection on his shins and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, a composite of wooden slivers somehow woven together so as to provide strength and distance. The spearhead was made of iron, and it weighed 600 shekels, which, according to my mathematical renderings, comes to about 25 pounds, just the head of the spear. I think my M1 rifle weighed about 9 pounds at the beginning of the 10-mile hike, and about 40 pounds at the end. Adding it all up, you have quite an arsenal in one package, and the strength and know-how to use it. Oh yeah, there's a lot to fear here. So Goliath was a representation of fear, while David, by contrast, represents faith. David believed in the living God of Israel, had proven his worthiness in battle with lions and bears in defense of the sheep, and David was armed with only his faith in God, 5 stones and a sling. Now, one can speculate what the odds were in the contest. The Old Testament bookies, and I'm assuming they had them then, would find that the odds were heavily stacked in Goliath's favor. But the bookies would have been wrong, because the contest was really not between Goliath and David, but between fear and faith, Goliath's gods and the living God. When one takes that into perspective, there really is no contest. But the problem that is not the perspective we usually see, and this is true on a personal level and on an international level. For when the rattling of swords are heard, like the nuclear threat in Iran, for example, all we see is the danger. Now, I'm not suggesting that we take this lightly. We need a strong defense in this world. What I'm saying is that military strength, while often necessary, will not guarantee peace. The world has forgotten this time after time after time. I believe that every politician who runs for office needs to read this story. This is not just a fine fairy tale, but a proclamation of God's mighty activity in the world. Time and again, people of faith have stepped forward to face the Goliaths of the world and have made a difference. My thought goes to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lost his life fighting Hitler. But his works remains as an eternal proclamation of God's love for the world. And you can add to the list of thousands of people who stood up against the giants and made a difference. Trust in God, the force that has held the world together when fear and might try to tear it apart. But how can we deal with the Goliath that's standing before us, eclipsing our view of hope for the future, for a happy life, and a well-lived life? Well, within this narrative is the answer, and it's so subtle that I have missed it for years. When David came to the camp and confronted his brothers, they asked who was tending the sheep. Now think about it for a moment. The army of Israel is on the brink of destruction. They have been quaking in their boots for over 40 days against this giant. The very existence of their country is at stake. And what do they want to know? Who's tending the sheep? Hey, you can't make this stuff up. It's in the book. Who's tending the sheep? And we've all done this. In fact, this is one of Satan's greatest tools. And all the devil has to do is to get our minds on the trivial rather than the important. An excellent book written by C.S. Lewis. Many of you have known him. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And one of his books is called The Screwtape Letters. And these are letters from the devil, Scratch, to his associate, Wormwood, on how to convert people to the darker side. And one of the greatest ways Scratch uses is to distract us from the important issues of our life. Let me read a section of this book. Scratch is speaking to Wormwood. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he was reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a minute. But before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and began to attempt a defense by argument, I would have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the point of the man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made this counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them. And that this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been his line, for when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning. The patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, "Much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind." By that time, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. Yes, it isn't that we want to be unfaithful. It's just easier to let the little things distract us from the real issues of our life. But we as individuals and as a church often do this. So we are called to keep the main thing, so God can take care of the Goliaths. As our pulpit committee begins their search, I think they have the right attitude. For they're not saying, "Well, I don't like the way he preaches," or "maybe her people skills aren't quite what they should be," or "how well will he relate to our kids?" I'm not saying these are unimportant. Of course they are. But the committee should not lose sight of the main thing, and that is to get a person who will help this church grow spiritually and lead us in the work of the kingdom of God. You see, our Goliaths aren't really our problem. Our calling is to rely upon God's grace and power. When we do that, our Goliaths don't have a chance. So let me sum up, and I want to do it in a different way. One of my favorite singing groups, other than the Andrews Sisters, and if you have to ask who that is, you're too young. But one of my favorite singing groups is the Martins, and they have summed up quite well what I've been trying to say. The song is entitled, "Somebody Get Me a Stone." Let's listen.
Just standing there. After all, the man was over 9 feet tall. But a little boy about half his size, with a stubborn faith burning in his eyes, didn't really seem to be afraid at all. You see, little David knew what the others did not. There's not a giant or an army too big for God. Makes me wanna say, somebody give me a stone, somebody give me a slate. Then step aside and watch God do his thing. We got a giant in our way, but that's about to change today. When you stand for God, you don't stand alone. Somebody give me a star. Everybody has their own giant to face. Some smaller, some taller, whatever the case. Don't we all have problems big
congregation said, Amen.